Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. We've been talking a lot about misinformation, disinformation, free speech in recent weeks. Well, someone who has been talking for a lot longer than we have about those topics is Glenn Greenwald. And I'm sure we disagree on a whole bunch of stuff, but I would defend his right to say whatever he likes. So welcome to the show, Glenn.
Thank you. It's good to talk to you again. You made me sound a little old with that introduction. I've been here's someone who's been talking about it for way longer than I have, but I nonetheless appreciate it.
Let's just dive straight into an actual current example we have, which is the shooting in Slovakia of the Prime Minister Robert Fico. So this has been evolving in live time. We don't have a huge amount of information on it, but you've already observed that the way it's been presented in some of the, let's call it establishment media, is already making certain insinuations. What have you spotted?
I've been very interested in Slovakian Prime Minister election last year. I covered it a lot because of how interesting I find Prime Minister Fico to be. He was kind of a, two-time Prime Minister previously, and he was kind of very identified as this standard left liberal in EU politics. And then suddenly he kind of rebranded himself. He ran on opposition to financing the war in Ukraine, which for a country like Slovakia, which had been very pro-Ukraine up until that point, for him to win on that, I just thought it was a very interesting dynamic. I think it indicates a sort of new type of populism that comes from the left in various European countries that we're seeing. But so I wanted to provide some background that I had on who he was. And so I did, but then I immediately realized that a lot of people are immediately trying to extract or imply motive of the shooter from whatever their pet cause happens to be. So a lot of people are saying, last week he denounced EU immigration plans, implying that that was why he killed. So I immediately noted, so that my note wasn't misinterpreted, that it was just, several hours ago, we know nothing about the shooter, let alone what motivated the shooter to take that action. A lot of times in these cases, people assume it's politically motivated. Sometimes it's because of psychological problems that a lot of these shooters are plagued by. And I thought it was so important to say, don't make assumptions until we actually have evidence.
Right, and that would go both ways. I mean, if we're treating it as a case study, there will be people who want to say, it's because he was against, the shooter was against his Ukraine policy and was some kind of Zelensky plant or something. There'll be a whole bunch of theories in that direction. And then conversely, as you say, it could be Russia, there'll be a lot of people trying to join the dots, and we shouldn't yet.
Right. I think it's normal to want to know the motive. I mean, an assassination attempt that almost succeeds, and it still might, but looks like he'll survive, but he was shot 5 times. It's a very serious event. Of course, you want to know what political currents are behind it, and there's an attempt to immediately be the first to kind of give a little tidbit here, a little tidbit there about the shooter. The problem is, and again, this is what I think so often is not taken into account, is a lot of times people who do these sorts of things are motivated because they're psychologically ill. Maybe they have like a pretense of a political agenda. But if you saw the immediate interrogation, he kind of looked disturbed, although someone who does that right away will appear that way. But I remember there was a attack in Canada. I was actually in Canada when it happened on the Parliament in Ottawa. I believe it was 2015. And because the shooter was Muslim, it was immediately declared to be a terrorist attack, that they were attacking in retaliation for Canadian participation in the bombing of Iraq and Syria. And it turned out that the guy had a long history of mental illness. It all came out at trial. And so the original perceptions about the story, even though he was Muslim and politically active, turned out to be false. I've seen that so many times. And as a journalist, I think you have to be the one to say, we don't know any of these things yet, and we just have to wait.
So our audiences, and where we all need to get to as individuals, is a little bit more of a sort of sophisticated way of approaching information, where you become aware of the slant of the environment you're in. If all of the information is kind of pointing in one way, you need to be aware of it and yet not leap to the opposite conclusion by default. Let's try and apply this to Israel and the kind of campus protests, the whole controversy that's going on in the US. Give me your overall, our audience may be familiar with it, but give us your overall assessment of the sort of information environment around that controversy. Where do you think most of the bias is?
Well, the United States is an extremely pro-Israel country and has been for a long time, probably the single most pro-Israel country, except for Germany, which obviously has its own idiosyncratic motives. The United States always aids Israel. It stands by Israel in every war that it has, regardless of which party is in place. It's gotten more U.S. aid than any other. Most people in media are extremely pro-Israel. What has changed, in not just this case, but so many other cases, is that now we don't just get information from a tiny number of large corporate media outlets. We can see things for ourselves on the internet. So people in Gaza can show us the results of Israeli bombs instead of having to hear from a tiny concentration of big media corporations. And on the one hand, that's obviously very liberating and freeing because you get to see things for yourself that you probably wouldn't otherwise be shown. On the other hand, it can also be very distortive because people can create perceptions on social media by anecdote that may not reflect the reality. I mean, I think you see that with the protesters too. You know, there have been a few occasions where there has been some aggressive or inappropriate behavior on the part of pro-Palestinian protesters, and it creates this perception that they're all violent or anti-Semitic or aggressive, when in reality, studies have been done now, one in particular, that proved that 99% of every one of these pro-Palestinian protests was not largely peaceful, but entirely peaceful. There's been almost no violence in any of these protests, but if you follow certain social media feeds, you would think the exact opposite is true, and I think you can create perceptions about Israeli aggression as well that may be true and may not be true. So, I mean, I think we have to, I'm personally very grateful that now so many other voices can convey information. But of course, you have to be careful that you yourself are not being manipulated by things that are being curated for you.
What would be the limits for you of the kind of free speech example in the case of the Palestinian protests? Do you feel like if protesters on college campuses or in cities are actually being intimidating to Jewish people, that for you would be a threshold that you wouldn't want to go past? Or where do you draw the line?
It depends what you mean by intimidating. A lot of things can be intimidating to people that are nonetheless perfectly appropriate and protected. Trans people have been arguing for a long time on college campuses that they feel intimidated when they see protests saying there are only two genders and gender and trans identities are false, or when people misgender them, or when they feel like there's even kind of like a eradication or genocidal kind of discourse. Like speakers have come and said we need to eradicate transgenderism from our society. And they say, we feel very threatened. We're a vulnerable minority group. Not many of us. A lot of people dislike us. There's violence against us. And this kind of speech makes us feel threatened, and therefore it needs to be curbed. And I think there has been a growing consensus, certainly one that I share, that you cannot look at words as violence. That sometimes when free speech is offered, there are going to be negative consequences. Bad ideas will be circulated. Other people will feel uncomfortable. So I think the fact that some, not all Jewish students, because a lot of Jewish students are part of these protests, but some who support Israel might hear things like globalized intifada or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And they feel like there's some kind of an attack on them through words. But I think we have to kind of draw the line and say words are not violence. Free speech is something that might make other people uncomfortable, but that's the nature of it. Obviously, I draw the line when it comes to physical assault, physical threats, obviously violence.
What about physical
Those things
blocking?
are already against the law.
We've seen quite a lot of videos, which may not be, representative, of Jewish students or individuals not being allowed into certain parts of campuses where they're doing protests. There's a sort of physical blocking. Is that problematic to you?
Well, so I just want to, we'll answer that for sure, but just on the premise, I think it's so important not to conflate Israel supporters and supporters of the Israeli war in Gaza with all Jews. So if there is, people catcalling or harassing or haranguing people who support the Israeli war in Gaza, there are a lot of Jews who support the Israeli war in Gaza and a ton of non-Jews who do as well. And on the other side, you have a ton of Jewish people who are, so it's being depicted as Jewish students being harassed as if they're looking for Jews, when in reality, Jews are among them all the time and they're embraced and they're welcomed. It's people who support the war in Israel. So I think it's important to just note that. But as for your argument, I don't like, and I'm not comfortable with, protesters blocking the ingress and egress of anybody on a college campus, say, because college campus spaces are supposed to be available to everybody. And I think, there's something not just intimidating, but I would even say illegal about saying you can't cross here because physically we're going to block you. So I don't like all the tactics of the protesters, but in the scheme of how the law looks at that kind of behavior generally, how the law looks at protests who get a little out of hand, those things are not usually punished as crimes or anything like that. They're administrative matters, they're the administration matters, things for college campuses to deal with. And I don't like those kind of tactics.
Just on the other side of that, sometimes those people who are telling the stories of having been harassed are themselves almost looking for trouble. We've had lots of examples where you're not sure if they're almost like sort of crisis actors or people who are looking to cause a scene. And would your view be different? I'm not saying this is one such case, but we had a big example here in the UK of someone who was an activist who was wearing a kippah and came into the protest and was warned by the police, so you are visibly Jewish and maybe you should steer clear. How should we approach complicated examples where people are maybe kind of entering a protest in order to attract attention?
I think someone who's visibly Jewish, quote unquote, is doing absolutely nothing wrong, and any attempt to intimidate or harass or block them solely because they're Jewish is an act of anti-Semitism. It's an act that is quite ugly, and we should not encourage or even tolerate. I think it's much different than, say, going up to an encampment where people are protesting a war that they perceive to be a genocide, people who are from that region, who have relatives who have been killed, and marching up to them with an Israeli flag saying, for example, kill all Arabs or Gaza is ours. Now, again, I don't think even in that case that it would be justified to attack them or even block them. But I think a lot of these social media clips, you have to be very careful of, because sometimes you see the end result, but you don't see what provoked it. And really, the only violence that we've actually seen, the only real violence we've seen was at the UCLA, at least in the United States, was at the UCLA protest where there was an encampment of pro-Palestinian protesters. A bunch of pro-Israel counter-protesters showed up, most of whom didn't go to that school, and began attacking them violently, throwing metal barricades and the like. Anything that involves violence or even blockading people from passage, I think should be deemed either illegal or inappropriate. But we just have to be careful that it's a difference between being visibly Jewish or being visibly in support of the war.
And you should be able to be either, as long as violence isn't in the frame. What about saying kill all Arabs or kill all Jews? In your view, should that be legal? Should that be allowed? If you're a free speech absolutist, I guess there's an argument to say it's unpleasant, but is it a direct incitement of... Yes, it's an incitement to violence, and I suppose it would be illegal, but where do you stand on that?
Well, so there is, at least in the United States, very clear case law on that question. I'll just quickly tell you the case because it's so important to reflect the principle. In 1968, a Ku Klux Klan member or leader stood up in Ohio and gave a speech saying, if our government doesn't stop being so anti-white, it will be time to take vengeance on them. So it was advocating the use of violence against the U.S. government. He was convicted in Ohio under terrorist statutes, inciting terrorism, and the Supreme Court overturned the conviction and said, no, you're allowed to advocate the abstract use of violence. You're allowed to say, let's go bomb Iran and kill all of them. You're allowed to say, let's turn Gaza into a parking lot. You're allowed to say, let's eliminate the Israeli state. Those are political acts that you're defending, and those are acts that are permissible in a First Amendment free speech context. What you can't do is immediate incitement. So there's a crowd gathered with torches on a corner, and you say, over there is a supporter of Israel, go burn down his house. But anything short of imminent incitement to violence, meaning actually directing the crowd to go right now and kill somebody or burn down their house, is within the realm of free expression. And we have that all the time. You can go to every pro-Israel protest, and you'll hear people saying, turn Gaza into a parking lot, kill all Arabs. I don't really think there's any documented cases on American campuses of people saying kill all Jews, but obviously there are people saying eliminate the Zionist state, eliminate Israel as a Jewish state, and so that would imply violence. We're in the West, we constantly talk about what wars we want to fight, who we want to bomb, who we want to kill. This is common in Western discourse, and I think, you can't make exceptions based on which groups you like or dislike.
And from the river to the sea, the most common example of that, in your view, could be interpreted a number of ways and therefore should be allowed unambiguously, or where do you stand on that?
I do think for sure it can be interpreted a lot of different ways, including a nonviolent means of trying to liberate Palestinians, both in Israel and outside of Israel, without implying violence. But even if it did mean dismantle the Israeli state, allow it to become once again a state for Arabs or Palestinians, to me it's no different than saying, let's go bomb the shit out of Iran, or let's go turn Gaza into a parking lot. I mean, these are very common sentiments that we hear in the West all the time. We've talked about wars, we've launched wars, we've talked about what leaders we want to kill, and that is clearly permissible within Western discourse. I think the problem and the danger becomes when you start picking and choosing who you're allowed to say that about and who you're not allowed to say that about.
So I don't know, but we probably may disagree on some of where the different arguments lead on this particular question. But what has depressed me is how many people on the political right who have been strong advocates for free speech for years, who've been really upset about being censored on trans issues, on all sorts of controversies, COVID, who've been on my show, who we've all been working with on these issues when it comes to Israel, have flipped and seem to have a much lower tolerance for freedom of expression in the other direction. I guess you have observed that as well.
I couldn't agree more. It's driving me insane. It's very easy, and I would say even quite meaningless, to defend free speech, to wave the free speech banner, to oppose censorship, when the views that are being targeted are the views that you share or with you have some sort of an affinity. Everybody is opposed to censorship of their comrades, of their political faction, of their own political views. Obviously, nobody thinks their own views should be censored. It's so easy to say, well, we have the right to say this. The only real test of whether someone is an authentic and a genuine free speech defender is whether, in the cases where the views that are being targeted are the ones they most hate, they're willing to invoke the same principles and the same standards and not search for justifications for censorship. Suddenly, oh, now that's hate speech. Suddenly, their words are violence. Suddenly, we're going to use safetyism rationale on college campuses to try and limit speech. And I wouldn't say by any means all. There have been some very prominent right-wing, more like pundits and journalist types, very much fewer politicians, who have been waving the free speech banner for the last decade when it comes to conservative speech, who are also saying we cannot suddenly become the censors. But in Washington, among the political class, and even mostly among the journalist class on the right, there has been a hypocrisy so visible and suffocating that it's actually nauseating, where they're reading from the exact same script that when it's come from the left for a lot of years, they've heaped scorn on. And I should say, a lot of times people say, oh, well, we're just playing their game. Censorship of Israel critics on American college campuses and throughout the West has been one of the primary forms of censorship for a long time. It didn't just start on October 7th. It's not some tit-for-tat game that the right is playing. It's one of the primary forms of censorship that we've seen in the West for a long time.
Do you want to name some names for us? Who are the culprits here? People who you've been disappointed by, who've been good free speech advocates and have switched since October 7th?
Well, I'll just give you one example that illustrates the kind of hypocrisy. Dave Rubin is somebody who built his entire career by waving a free speech flag, branding himself a free speech advocate. 2 weeks after October 7th, both France and Germany banned pro-Palestinian protests. You were still allowed to have pro-Israel protest. You were allowed to protest against any other country you want, just not against Israel. And Dave Rubin, who has been saying for a decade that the West is collapsing because we don't allow free speech anymore, said, oh, maybe the West can be saved after all in response to that news. In other words, now suddenly censorship is the thing that will save the West rather than kill the West. Ben Shapiro, who also has built his career based on very similar values that he says he believes in, Palantir, the big intelligence firm, announced that it was setting aside 180 jobs solely for American Jewish students on college campuses. And Ben Shapiro went and praised that. And then when even his own followers who love Israel were saying, wait a minute, you're now in favor of set-aside programs for minority students because this time it's Jews and people who support Israel? That seems pretty hypocritical. He then had to reverse it at the end of the day and say, oh, you know what? It probably should be available for everybody. But there's been a lot of that, either supporting censorship or just ignoring it and just being silent about it.
I should say, Ben or Dave, if you're watching, you're welcome to come on the show and defend yourself from that charge.
Or on mine, too.
Or indeed on Glenn.
I've invited them. Yeah.
So how do you think you stack up on that measure then? Because there may be people watching who say, well, he's talking a good talk here about being fair and on each side, but we all know Glenn Greenwald has a worldview. I think that's fair to say. We will be critical of the US, critical of Israel, perhaps more than most. Do you feel that you have done enough to show that you will defend those principles? I mean, are you out there on social media pointing out when the pro-Palestinian protesters are going too far, when they are actually genuinely threatening or coming close to violence? Are you doing a good enough job on showing that you're sticking up to that principle?
I mean, I think the way that you prove you're a consistent free speech advocate is by purposely seeking out the views that you most hate when they're being censored and defending that. So as a lawyer, which I was before I was a journalist, I defended far-right and even neo-Nazi groups when their free speech was being attacked. Obviously, I'm a gay Jewish man. I don't like Nazi ideology, to put that mildly, but understand that if you allow those breaches, even for that kind of speech, then those breaches will expand and encompass a whole bunch of other kinds of ideas. I have spent the last decade defending the right of right-wing voices and conservative students on college campuses to express a wide range of views on race, on sexual orientation, on gender ideology that I not only don't share but disagree with, but I find the censorship far more dangerous than the speech itself. And so, yes, in this case, it is true that I'm denouncing censorship of views with which I'm largely sympathetic, but I think I have as much credibility as anyone in having proved over many years that I defend free speech at least as robustly, if not more so, when it comes to the ideas that I most hate. You know, I don't really think it's my job to police every protester, but I've certainly made clear, as I did when you asked, that I don't like some of the tactics the protesters have been using, like blocking people from entering their camp if they perceive they're supportive of Israel. That to me is like a kind of thuggish bullying tactic that doesn't have a lot to do with free activism, free protest, and free speech. But in the context of everything that's happening, I think, I have not made that my crusade.
Why do you think it is that so few people now are prepared to at least try to do that? I guess it's the fundamental liberal instinct, isn't it? To defend a principle even when it advantages your political opponents. And that's been the basis of the liberal settlement for a long time. It feels like that is in retreat. And both political poles are increasingly comfortable with a winner-takes-all type of politics. What's your big picture? What's your analysis of that? Where did all the liberals go?
Censorship is a very tempting tactic to embrace for all of us. There's always going to be speech that we think is extremely damaging, that we think is extremely dangerous, that we think is extremely threatening to the things we hold dearest. I mean, in the First Amendment, in the Constitution, when the founders of the United States wrote a constitution, the very first right they identified in the Bill of Rights was the right to free speech and a prohibition on the government infringing it, because history shows that, we're tribal, we're passionate about certain things, especially things that affect us or our tribe or our group. And there's always a very strong temptation that human beings have to want to prohibit certain views, even though they think they're free speech advocates, on the ground that those are just too hateful, too dangerous, too inflammatory. I think that temptation is always there. But I also do think that what has happened in the West over the last, say, 10 to 20 years, and I think Europe's always behind in this regard. Europe has always been more willing to tolerate censorship and more comfortable with quote-unquote hate speech laws than the United States. But in the United States as well, which obviously is a big influence on the West, there has been implanted this framework that ideas that are hateful, ideas that might incite anger or attack or violence against vulnerable minority groups can be censored. And now, in the last, say, 7 years, I think really since Brexit and the victory of Donald Trump in 2016, you have this added notion that quote-unquote disinformation is so dangerous that you need the government to step in or big tech companies to step in and prohibit that as well. And there's a kind of censorship now that is tolerated that I don't think would have, one of the very first things the EU did after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was enact a law making it illegal to any platform to allow RT or Sputnik or other Russian state media to be heard. So if you're an adult European citizen and you want to hear what the Russians are saying, the EU has made it extremely difficult for you to be able to access that because it's illegal to platform those media outlets so you can't hear the other side. That to me is shocking, but it didn't make very many waves. I think, we're seeing now laws being enacted in the Congress that adopt this broadened definition of anti-Semitism that includes things like comparing the actions of the Israeli state to Nazism, or claiming that certain Jewish individuals have a greater loyalty to Israel than they do to the United States, or even saying that you think Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. Ideas that have been around for a long time that people believe in, that are not violent, that are prohibited under this expanded definition. It's just this creeping, once you enact the mentality that certain ideas are so hateful that they can be banned, every group is going to want to kind of grab some of that for their own benefit.
But why do you think it's happening now, though? That's the question. I would agree. It's definitely happening. Canada, the US, and indeed definitely in Europe as well, there is less and less tolerance for hearing uncomfortable things that advantage your opponents. And both sides are guilty of this, I feel like. But why now? What is it, big picture, it feels definitely like 30, 40 years ago, there was a much higher degree of confidence that society would survive, even if there were some nasty opinions floating around. But that's gone.
Yeah, I think we have to be a little bit careful about romanticizing the past. There have been a ton of censorship, moral panics, at least in the United States. For a long time, people who were assumed to be communists weren't allowed to practice law. They weren't allowed to be heard in certain cases. A lot of the most important free speech precedents in the United States are restricting or limiting the ability to, say, punish communists for their ideology. There were a lot of various acts immediately after the founding, and then in World War I, Woodrow Wilson succeeded in enacting this Espionage Act of 1917, which is still the kind of thing that's used to prosecute people like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and even Donald Trump. That was designed to criminalize dissent to U.S. involvement in World War I, and it ended up imprisoning people like Union Debs. So there's been we don't want to kind of create this ideal past, but I agree with you, it has gotten more intense, more kind of widely accepted, and I think, and it's a lot of reasons, but I think it's very cultural that there has been this idea that people have the right now to feel comfortable at all times, never to feel like they're being confronted with ideas that make them uncomfortable or feel unsafe, that's now the highest value. And it's kind of, I think, starting with the millennial generation, and certainly even more so with Gen Z, that once you go to college, you're not even an adult. You still have to be protected, almost like a child. So the college administrators and deans replace your parents. And then it's even now extended into the workplace, where people go to work and they also anticipate or expect to be protected from ideas that make them uncomfortable. And the HR department is what replaces the college dean, which in turn replaces the parent. So I think there has been bred in the book Coddling of the American Mind is probably the best that traces this devolution, that there's this expectation that people have the right to be protected, not just from violent attacks, but from words. And it kind of, transformed from childhood, where arguably it belongs, into early adulthood at college, where it doesn't, and then now into the workplace, where it most definitely doesn't. And now it's just this generalized expectation that value, feeling comfortable, never feeling challenged, never feeling like you're exposed to ideas that make you unsafe, is a higher value than free speech itself. And once that tipping point was reached, it was kind of just the floodgates were open.
The other new thing is that there is now the mechanism through the internet, through these vast technology companies, to actually control a narrative in a way that was not possible 40 years ago. And we've got caught up in that recently with being put on a blacklist by a strange organization called the Global Disinformation Index that we'd never even heard of, somewhere deep in the bowels of the internet, which acts like a gatekeeper for online ad systems. And I feel like the complexity of the online world and the oligopoly of the companies that control it is like the perfect censors environment.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important developments in the last decade in the West, especially for the cause of a free internet, which was also the cause when I did the Snowden reporting, keep the internet free of government surveillance, otherwise it loses its value, and now keep it free of censorship for the same reason. If you can actually trace the advent of this new quote-unquote disinformation industry. I mean, the whole idea of a disinformation expert is a completely fabricated credential. It's a fabricated expertise. There's nobody as kind of a generalized means more competent to identify disinformation than other people. Obviously, in specialized areas, you would trust a surgeon more than a lay person to debate medical issues, or a trained pilot more than a lay person to debate aviation issues. But there's no such thing as a person who is just kind of like a free-floating arbiter who's more able to decree truth than other people. It's a completely invented and concocted expertise that's designed to make political censorship have the prettified appearance of being something neutral, apolitical, and scientific. And the whole industry is completely new. It immediately emerged right after 2016, where, as I said, the dual traumas to Western liberalism of Brexit, followed by Donald Trump's victory of Hillary Clinton, made Western elites conclude that they could no longer trust a free internet. They could no longer allow free speech to be unconstrained and out of their control, because when it is, they can no longer control the behavior of the citizenry. So they go and vote for Brexit, they elect Donald Trump, they make bad decisions. And one of the means, because of course they couldn't admit they were engaged in political censorship on the internet, to do so is it popped up all these disinformation groups with very banal and kind of neutral sounding names, including the one you just mentioned. And if you look at who funds them, it's always the same small group of people. It's either a handful of neoliberal billionaires like Pierre Omidyar or Bill Gates or George Soros. It's not conspiratorial. It's just that's who really funds them. Or the U.S. security state or even British intelligence and EU security agencies or big tech that says this is going to be our arbiter. They all have the same ideology. It's entirely designed to take anti-establishment views and label them disinformation as a means for a justification for banning them or for limiting their spread, when in reality, I think you can obviously make the case that the most amount of quote-unquote disinformation comes from the very large establishment factions, including corporate media, that is purporting to combat disinformation through these kind of tools. And that, to me, is the most dangerous development, at least as far as the free internet is concerned.
Here's what we've come up against, that I've been making a lot of noise about this, and the fact that it's received government money is something that I can very legitimately claim and complain about. We've got a response from the government, at least in the UK, saying they will not fund it anymore. I count that as a small victory. There are other governments still funding them. But actually, even if you had no government funding, these things would still exist. And where I almost despair, or I don't know what your thoughts would be, is it's actually ultimately comes from corporations. The incentive to stay what they would consider safe, to put their advertising dollars next to kind of approved narratives and to live in a less controversial, less combative world, seems to be very attractive to big corporations, which ultimately pay for everything. So I've sort of run out of road here on this complaint.
The whole point of the Enlightenment, which gave rise to all sorts of institutions that we still cherish today, including the American founding, but all sorts of others, was that we never trust centralized large institutions any longer to dictate to us what is true and what is false, whether it be monarchs or the church or any other, that we have the right as individuals to engage in free and open discourse, to use our capacity for reason to decide for ourselves what we believe. That is really what's at stake. Of course, when you have the power to control the flow of information, when you have the power to determine what people in a large country can hear and what they cannot hear, you control their thought and therefore their behavior, and how power is dispersed is incredibly valuable power that, of course, power centers are going to try to recoup for themselves. They lost it through the internet, and they're now trying to degrade the internet into that model where they, again, giant corporations working hand in hand with government, try and control the kinds of ideas that can be expressed and the kinds of ideas that can be heard. That's an incredible power. Of course, no establishment sector is going to lose that power without a fight. That's why, to me, this kind of struggle, this battle to preserve internet freedom is of the highest priority for me. And I cherish most the spaces, the platforms, the companies that are truly devoted to resisting the censorship framework because of how tyrannical it is. I mean, I know we don't like to use the word tyranny for our own countries in the West, but that's what it is. It's authoritarian and tyrannical to have these institutions, corporate or governmental, empowered to dictate what is truth and what is falsity. It's obviously what Orwell warned about with the Ministry of Truth, or just in general to be able to control the list of ideas that are permitted and the ones that aren't.
And do you feel in any way optimistic? You mentioned some channels coming up, but perhaps you would include ours and your own, and there are others which are growing and have some influence, albeit small compared to the corporate media, that are at least trying to be more independent. I also observe a kind of slightly negative trend among some of those anti-establishment voices, that they themselves have their own pathologies and strange behaviors. They form their own cliques and groups. They tend to get more and more reactionary as a trend, I would say, until they're kind of self-reinforcing, and they're another herd, they're another power center. Do you despair even about the anti-establishment media?
I agree with your critique of independent media completely. There's also the big problem of audience capture, that if you're not relying on corporate advertisers or, financing by billionaires, which are alternative ways, you rely on your audience, then there's a strong temptation never to tell them what they don't want to hear because of fear of losing their financial support. These are all terrible incentives. But any institution, any subculture constructed by human beings, by definition, is going to be imperfect. It's going to be corrupted. It's going to have flaws. I think the most important thing is to have a multiplicity of them. So even if, there's people over there in that corner challenging establishment dogma because they make a lot of money off of it, or they're getting a lot of attention. They have corrupt motives, bad motives, self-interested motives. It's still the more diversity of views that are permitted to flow, the less constraints there are on ideas that can flow, the better. And it may be the case that there are a bunch of different power centers that have bad motives among them, but it's still better than having everything homogenized into one set of opinions controlled by a centralized source.
Okay, final question for you. I know you have to go. If there is a role for government, let's say right now, for example, since the little experience we've had here in the UK, there's a lot of people inside government who are looking for ideas. They genuinely are not happy about what happened to us. They want to know, hey, what should we do? And I don't have a long list of ideas. I mean, is there any role for government to actually try to retain that multiplicity? In other words, instead of working hand in glove with big tech and with corporations, they should actually be trying to break them up, trying to, observe the tendency towards bigness. What would you like to see governments do that they're not?
Yeah, I think the first thing governments need to do is keep their hands off the internet. We've seen in your country, this Online Safety Act, in the EU, the Digital Services Act. There's terrible laws pending in Canada and Brazil. And we've seen the Biden administration pressuring big tech companies to censor. So the first step is keep the government out of the business of trying to control the flow of information. But then you have the secondary problem, as you alluded to, that these giant corporations can also do that because they're the ones who control these platforms. And I think part of the responsibility of government, I very much believe, is to prevent monopolies from emerging. So if there's too much power concentrated in too few hands, that level of financial and economic inequality, observe the American founders and many other people, will translate into political inequality by definition, a kind of tyranny that comes from this massive wealth. It's not a communist idea. It's not saying we need socialism. It's saying that part of the duty of government is to prevent monopolistic power. And I think I'm very much behind these efforts in the EU and increasingly in the United States to break up Google, to break up Facebook, to break up Amazon and Apple in order to make the market more competitive and ensure a competition of views and ideas and other emerging platforms because they have too much power centralized in the hands of a tiny few corporate actors.
Could they even make it the law that if there were big quasi-monopolies like YouTube or Google, that if they did any censorship, they would have to have a transparent mechanism, they'd have to tell people about it, offer an appeal, etc.? I mean, would you be in favor of that? The government kind of stepping into these organizations and legislating?
Or just banning it all. I mean, if you look at, say, the telephone company, which is treated as a utility because of, at least in the United States, and I'm not sure in Europe, you could never have, for example, AT&T say, oh, this person has radical ideas that we don't want to be associated with, so that we're going to deny them telephone service. Nobody holds the telephone company responsible for radicals who organize bad ideas or even crimes over the telephone. The idea is this is a public service available for everybody. We're seeing the exclusion of people based on their political views from the financial services industry, being banned from PayPal, excluded from banks, having their bank accounts closed, or not being able to open ones. I think the government does have a role in preserving the openness of these kinds of services and prohibiting people from being discriminated against based on their political ideology.
Glenn, as always, lots of really interesting, challenging ideas. Thanks for your time today.
Yeah, always happy to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
That was Glenn Greenwald talking to us from Brazil, where he lives. As always, clear-eyed, clear-thinking, logical. He's a great person to have a conversation with, whether you agree with his opinions or not. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more exclusive content from UnHerd, go to unherd.com/join. Thanks to Glenn, and thanks to you. This was UnHerd.